The subject of entity attachments and interferences has become much more known and popular in the so-called truth movement and in certain spiritual and New Age circles over the past 5 to 10 years. Personally, I've studied this topic for over 20 years and had my own experiences and battles with these forces. However, there are still many misconceptions about this topic, and I'll address the two major ones in this video. Before I get started, I also want to give a very brief summary of this topic for anyone who's new to it. You can also find out way more about it on my website, veilofreality.com, with many articles, videos, and resources. Now, in a nutshell, there's way more to our reality than our five senses can perceive. Our reality is embedded in a complex system of unseen worlds and influenced by hidden forces of a higher, hyperdimensional reality. The forces at work are not all good, and we are not on top of the food chain. Food, in this context, doesn't have to be physical. Malevolent entities feed off of certain emotions and frequencies, predominantly reactive emotional turmoil that is projected externally, such as violence, anger, hate, envy, jealousy, lust, and sexual energy of the lower nature, fear, anxiety, gossip, shadow projections, to name a few. These occult forces tempt humans with greed, power, and sex, working through them, implanting thoughts, suggestions, false spiritual and religious ideologies, beliefs, and desires that are not their own, but humans mistake them as their own. Various esoteric traditions talk about this hyperdimensional matrix control system, each in their own way, that has influenced and controlled humanity for thousands of years. Don Juan, in Carlos Castaneda's work, called it the topic of all topics, speaking of a cosmic predator that uses man as food. Gurdjieff refers to the predator in the tale of the evil magician and the concept of the food for the moon. The Gnostics talked about the archons of darkness. In the Native American tradition, it is called Wetiko. The Shaitans of the Sufis and the Jinn in the Arabian esoteric traditions are supernatural creatures who inhabit an unseen world in dimensions beyond the visible universe and interfere with humanity. Rudolf Steiner refers in his work to the spirits of darkness that have taken over humanity, the Ahrimanic, Asuric, and Suratic spirits. Sri Aurobindo, in his Integral Yoga, talks about the powers of darkness that have interfered with the harmonious evolutionary creation. They are the Pishacha, Rakshasa, and Asura, the occult, hostile, and adverse forces, as he calls them. These are the forces and beings that are interested in maintaining the falsehood they have created in the world of the ignorance and in putting them forward as the truth which man must follow. I've seen many people fall into fear and paranoia when they come across this knowledge, or they misapply and misunderstand it. Most often, they also start to blame entities right away for everything they may be dealing with, and they start to see entities everywhere. The fear, blame, paranoia trap and frequency is exactly what these forces want you to get stuck in, for it draws them in, ironically. So, here's the first misconception. The most common mistake I've seen in people who come to think that it is an entity that is the cause of the suffering in their lives is that they make an assumption. Well, the assumption being that it is, in fact, an occult entity. You do not know for sure. There could be many other causes. So it's important not to abuse the topic of entity interferences and attachments for spiritual or psychological bypassing via shifting the blame externally. Many people I've worked with over the past 15 years and who thought and were very sure that they were dealing with an entity or entities had, in fact, none. But their issues were all related to unconscious childhood trauma and wounding, their unacknowledged shadow or their own thought projections and self-created entities out of their thought forms based on excessive fear, worry, and paranoia projections, as well as indulging in sexual fantasies and porn, which also creates thought form entities that feed on the sexual luge, reinforcing sexual desire based on lust. It can be a vicious cycle, especially in our over-sexualized culture. First of all, the vast majority of entity interferences are very subtle nuanced, and oftentimes hardly distinguishable from your own childhood trauma, triggers, shadow projections, and many other unconscious psychological causes. For example, Dr. William Baldwin emphasized in his work on spirit releasement therapy to know your mind and yourself very well, including all the different parts of your personality, such as the exile, the inner child, the inner critic, the inner manager, and so on, similar to internal family systems, before assuming that you may be dealing with an entity or an earthbound spirit attachment. Now, what does that mean, and how do we differentiate between what is mine and what may be coming from the outside in form of an occult interference of another entity? In other words, what do we need to integrate as part of our shadow or split off parts of ourselves due to trauma and childhood wounding, like a soul retrieval? And what do we need to reject as not parts of ourselves? Well, first of all, it is very important to understand and acknowledge that it takes a high level of being and soul embodiment connected to your true essence, your true self, with a still mind, an objective inner witness, and grounded psychic sensitivity, and most importantly, an in-depth understanding of your own psyche and mind to be able to discern what is what. So, that's already a very tall order, and it is advanced work. I've seen that many people overestimate their level of being and awareness and rush into all kinds of assumptions and projections about entities and become very fixated on this topic without doing the groundwork on a psychological and embodiment level. In fact, some people are simply not ready for deeper occult esoteric knowledge, and it can be dangerous for them, misapplying and distorting it, and it can retard their spiritual and soul development, getting lost in the occult maze, if there's no solid, grounded psychological foundation. The discernment will become naturally clearer in the process of sincere psycho-spiritual work and the process of soul embodiment, the more you're connected to your true self and essence. Another popular assumption that most people make when they suspect that they are impacted by an entity is that they need to find someone who can remove it for them, and then the issue will be resolved. Well, that is not always the case. Removing an entity is not enough, for it or they will come back tenfold if the original entry point has not been closed or healed. Very important to understand. These entry points are related to your ego blind spots, your lower animal nature, shadow aspects, wounds, weaknesses, addictions, and traumas stemming from childhood and even past lives that have gone unacknowledged, unintegrated, and unhealed. Most of that is unconscious within you. So, in other words, any entity attack, interference, or attachment corresponds to an entry point within. Your weaknesses, projections, reactive behavior, and issues become targets used against you, especially when you start to make conscious efforts to awaken. It is a known esoteric occult law, as the mother highlighted. Attacks from adverse forces are inevitable. You have to take them as tests on your way and go courageously through the ordeal. The struggle might be hard, but when you come out of it, you have gained something, you have advanced a step. There's even a necessity for the existence of the hostile forces. They make your determination stronger, your aspiration clearer. It is true, however, that they exist because you gave them a reason to exist. So long as there's something in you which answers to them, which are basically your wounds, traumas, shadow aspects, lower nature, and so forth, their intervention is perfectly legitimate. If nothing in you responded, if they had no hold upon any part of your nature, they would retire and leave you. Now you can see that's why trauma work, shadow work, and connecting to your true essence via combining psychological and spiritual work are the essential keys to eliminating the influence of occult hostile forces in our lives, permanently. In fact, in my experience in battles over the years, I found that any external entity removal is not even necessary at all, for it is just symptom management. But you need to be sincere in your inner work and don't give in to your compulsions and reactive behavior. In short, when you turn off their food source within you, which is established via sincere self-work, they will depart and leave you alone. And as a result, your aura becomes strong again like a defense shield. Remember also, The one place they cannot touch is your divine essence, your true self. So the more you are soul embodied and live from your true self, the less these forces can affect you. From a higher perspective, in light of the evolution of consciousness, it's also very important to understand that these entities and occult forces serve as a teaching function, for they highlight your issues and are to be seen as tests and lessons. The hostile forces have a certain self-chosen function. It is to test the condition of the individual, of the work, of the earth itself, and their readiness for the spiritual descent and fulfillment. The world is a learning experience where we experience both light and darkness, ignorance and truth, and we must rise to greater levels of non-dual reactivity and true self-awareness if we are to truly transcend the influence of these occult hostile forces who play on our weaknesses, core wounds, and mechanical nature like we are puppets on strings. There's way more to this topic, and in this video I just wanted to give a brief overview and address some of the misconceptions. If you want to learn more about this topic in way more depth, feel free to check out my 8-hour webinar, Occult Forces of Hyperdimensions, Entity Attachments and Interferences, Discernment, Clearing and Protection. This webinar is also included in our in-depth 14-week group coaching program, Embodied Soul Awakening, which you can find out more about at thattimeoftransition.com. In this 14-week program, we combine somatic psycho-spiritual work with occult esoteric work in a very grounding, effective, and practical way. Both are linked below in the info section. That being said, Godspeed.